Imagine you are the most powerful man on earth. You have never lost a battle. Kings kneel at your feet, and armies flee at the sound of your name. Now imagine leading 50,000 of your most loyal soldiers into a place where there is no enemy to fight, no glory to win, only sand, silence, and an unrelenting sun. This is not a story of conquest. It is a story of survival. And for the man they called Alexander the Great, it would become the greatest mistake of his life. What drove him to march into a desert that had already destroyed legendary kings before him? And why did 2/3 of his army never walk out? This is the true story of the desert that broke Alexander the Great. The year is 326 before the Common Era. The place is the banks of the Hyphasis River in the northern reaches of the Indian subcontinent. A man stands at the head of the greatest military machine the world has ever seen. He is Alexander III of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. In just 8 years, he has toppled the mighty Persian Empire, conquered Egypt, and marched east through territories so remote that even the most learned geographers of Greece could only guess at their existence. His army has just defeated the formidable King Porus in a brutal battle, a victory that added elephants to the list of wonders they had subdued. But now, for the first time in his meteoric career, Alexander faces an enemy he cannot defeat with a cavalry charge. That enemy is the will of his own men. They stand at the river's edge, looking east. Beyond that water, the locals whisper of vast plains teeming with more elephants, more kings, and more endless horizons. The army, however, has had enough. They are exhausted, drenched by monsoon rains and ravaged by tropical diseases. Their sandals are worn through, their weapons are dulled, and their hearts are heavy with a longing for homes they have not seen in nearly a decade. The mutiny is not a violent rebellion, but a quiet, immovable refusal. They will not go east. Alexander, the king who has never known defeat, is forced to turn back. But his mind, restless and ambitious, is already racing ahead. Turning back is not the same as going home. He cannot simply retrace his steps. That would be an admission that the tide of his conquest had reached its limit. Instead, he conceives a plan as audacious as any of his battles. He will divide his forces. His trusted general Craterus will lead the main army, along with the baggage trains and the wounded, on a slow and safe march through the familiar passes of the north. But Alexander himself, accompanied by his elite units, will take a different route. He will lead a portion of his army south, along the coast, through a region known from vague Persian reports as Gerusia. Modern maps call it the Makran, a vast and arid expanse spanning parts of today's Iran and Pakistan. Why would a brilliant strategist choose such a path? The official reason was to support his fleet, commanded by his admiral Nearchos, which was to sail along the coast and needed watering stations and safe harbors. But there is another more compelling reason, one that gnaws at the heart of Alexander's psychology. He was driven by a need to surpass all who came before him. Two legendary figures of the Persian past, the Queen Semiramis and the great King Cyrus the Great, had reportedly attempted to cross this desert and had failed catastrophically. Semiramis escaped with barely 20 survivors, Cyrus with only 7. For Alexander, this was not a warning, it was a challenge. He would succeed where the great kings of the Achaemenid dynasty had failed. He would prove that his authority was greater than theirs. And so, with a mixture of strategic necessity and personal ambition, Alexander marches his chosen force towards the edge of the known world. He is about to walk into a furnace, a land that cares nothing for the glory of kings. He is about to meet the desert. To understand what happened to Alexander's army, one must first understand the land that consumed them. Gedrosia was not merely a desert. It was an ancient, primordial landscape that seemed designed to reject human life, stretching for nearly 1,000 miles along the coast of what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. It was a region the Greeks could scarcely comprehend. The geographers of the time divided it into grim, descending circles of desolation. First, there was the coast, home to a people the Greeks would name the ichthyophagi, the fish-eaters. This was not a term of endearment, but a description of a reality so alien that it bordered on the monstrous. Here, between the mouths of the Hingol River and the Cape of Jask, the land was barren of grain and pasture. The inhabitants, eking out an existence on a shoreline littered with whale bones, built their huts not from wood or stone, but from the shells of mussels and the vertebrae of beached whales. They had no iron, sharpening their weapons on stones, and they subsisted on seafood, dried and pounded into a flour-like meal. Inland beyond this narrow coastal strip lay Gedrosia proper. If the coast was alien, the interior was hellish. The Greek historian Strabo described it as a country even more exposed to the scorching sun than India, a vast expanse of sand and rock, devoid of the fruits of cultivation. During the day, the heat radiated off the ground in visible waves, creating mirages that tormented thirsty men. The terrain itself was an obstacle, massive sand dunes that shifted with the wind, and fields of gravel so sharp they could shred a leather boot in a day's march. There were no trees save for the occasional stunted palm or thorny bush, offering no shade from the relentless sun. The most precious commodity, water, was almost entirely absent. The few rivers that existed were seasonal, filled only by the rare rains that fell in the distant northern mountains. For most of the year, their beds were dry, winding scars on the landscape, offering only the ghost of moisture. The wells that did exist were few and far between, their brackish water often a slow poison to men already driven mad with thirst. But there was a cruel twist to this geography. The locals knew that the summer monsoon, which brought misery to Alexander's men in India, also brought life to this dead land. The rains would fall in the northern highlands, sending flash floods down the dry riverbeds and briefly filling the natural cisterns along the coast. It was for this reason that Alexander timed his march for the months after the monsoon, hoping that the desert would be momentarily, barely passable. He was betting his life and the lives of his men on a temporary reprieve from one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet. He was betting that he could tame a land that time itself had forgotten. Before a single soldier stepped into the sands of Gedrosia, the march was already a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. To understand why the desert crossing became a catastrophe, we must first understand what it took to move an ancient army. This was not a simple matter of men walking from one point to another. It was the orchestrated movement of a city on the move. Thanks to the foundational work of modern historian Donald W. Engels, we can reconstruct the immense needs of Alexander's force. The army that entered Gedrosia was not just a compact fighting force. It numbered tens of thousands, including soldiers, camp followers, merchants, women, and children. Attached to this human column was a vast herd of animals, horses for the cavalry, pack mules and donkeys to carry equipment and the army's treasure, and oxen to pull the heavy supply wagons. Every single one of these creatures, human and animal, required food and water every single day. The numbers are staggering. A single soldier required approximately 3 pounds of grain per day. A cavalry horse needed 10 times that amount, along with vast quantities of grazing. An army of 30,000 men and 8,000 horses, a conservative estimate, would consume over 100,000 pounds of grain and 200,000 gallons of water each day. This is the equivalent of a small city's daily consumption, all of which had to be carried or found along the route. The Macedonian army had a sophisticated system for this. They marched in a specific order, with engineers and scouts ahead to locate water sources and campsites. Supply depots were established in advance, filled with grain requisitioned from local populations. The army could typically carry several days' worth of rations, but they were always dependent on finding water daily. A single day without water meant the animals began to die. 2 days meant the end of the army. This is why Alexander's decision to march through Gedrosia is so baffling. He was a master of logistics. He knew that to survive, his army needed to maintain a specific rate of march, to find water at predictable intervals, and to have access to supplies. In Gedrosia, none of these conditions could be guaranteed. The guides he hired were local, but the desert's features were ephemeral, shifting with the wind and the seasons. Even before the true horror began, Alexander had prepared as best he could. At his base camp near Patala, at the mouth of the Indus, he had gathered 4 months' worth of supplies, grain and cattle plundered from the rich lands of the Indus Delta. It was a massive stockpile, enough to feed his men for the estimated length of the march. But this was a static supply. Once the army moved, it would have to carry that food on its back. The weight of the food they consumed would be replaced by the weight of their own growing exhaustion. As the army finally turned its back on the Indus and began its journey west along the coast, the great logistical machine began its work. For a time it functioned. But ahead, in the shimmering heat, lay the land where no amount of planning could prepare them for what was to come. The initial phase of the march must have felt for a brief time like a vindication of Alexander's daring. After leaving the supply depots at Patala, The army marched for 9 days along the coast to the banks of the Anabasis River, which the locals called the Parali, flowing through what is now the Las Bela area. This was the boundary of the known. They had covered over 100 miles at a steady pace of about 12 miles a day. The army was still strong, the supplies held, and the first objective was within reach. Beyond the river lay the land of the Orytans, or Oritians, a people distinct from the Indians they had just left. The Greeks observed them with curiosity. They dressed like Indians and armed themselves similarly, but their language and customs were different. Some of those customs were, to the Greek mind, utterly barbaric. Diodorus, a later historian, recorded with a shudder the Arrian funerary practices. The relatives of the dead would carry the bodies out, strip themselves naked, and leave the corpses in thickets to be devoured by wild beasts. They would then divide up the clothing of the deceased and hold a banquet. To the Greeks, who honored their dead with proper burial rites, this was a sign that they had entered a world where the normal rules no longer applied. Alexander, ever the pragmatist, did not tarry to judge. He swept through the land in 3 columns, ravaging and subduing the territory. He was looking for something more permanent than conquest. He was looking for a legacy. At a place called Rambakia, the largest village of the Orytans, he stopped. He saw a sheltered harbor, a defensible position, and imagined a city rising from the dust. It would be a new Alexandria, a beacon of Hellenism on this desolate coast, a node in the vast network of trade and culture he was stitching across the world. He left his general Hephaestion to begin the work of building the city and appointed a satrap named Apollophanes to govern the land. But Alexander was not staying. He was pushing on towards the frontier of Gedrosia, leaving another commander, Leonatos, behind, with a force of Agrianians and archers, to protect the new settlement and wait for the fleet. Leonatos would soon have his hands full. No sooner had Alexander's main column vanished over the western horizon than the Orytans rose in rebellion. They attacked the fledgling city. Leonatos, a famously tough and belligerent commander who supposedly traveled with trainers and camel-loads of sand so he could practice wrestling, met them in battle. The fight was savage. According to the account of Nearchus, Leonatos killed 6,000 Orytans and all their leaders, while losing only 15 of his own cavalrymen. Among the Greek dead, however, was the satrap Apollophanes himself, a sign of how fierce the fighting had been. Alexander left a pacified province and a city under construction. But ahead, the coast was changing. The barren hills were creeping closer to the sea. The sparse vegetation was disappearing. The guides pointed westward and spoke of the next people, the ichthyophagi, the fish-eaters. The army was about to leave the last vestiges of the inhabited world and step into the true unknown. The army crossed the invisible border into the land of the fish-eaters, and the world changed. The coast became a nightmare of rugged, impassable cliffs and burning sand. The guides, perhaps more familiar with the interior trade routes than the immediate coastline, began to lose their way. They led the column too far inland, away from the sea breezes, and into a trap of suffocating heat. The first sign of disaster was the water. The wells they had been promised were often dry. When they did find water, it was often so brackish that it worsened the thirst it was meant to quench. Men drank greedily, only to be racked with cramps. The heat was relentless. Strabo describes the horror of the march in chilling detail, the deep burning sand that made every step a torment, the sand hills that required men to climb as if out of a pit, only to slide back down the other side. The army was forced to make its longest marches at night to avoid the worst of the sun, covering distances of up to 60 miles between watering holes. Discipline began to crack under the pressure of pure physical need. When they finally reached a water source, it became a scene of madness. Soldiers, their minds unhinged by thirst, would throw themselves into the water fully armed, drinking until they drowned. Their bloated bodies would then float to the surface, polluting the precious shallow cisterns for those who came after. Others, too exhausted to reach the water, simply lay down in the middle of the track. Their limbs would begin to shake uncontrollably, a sign of severe dehydration and heat stroke, and they would die there, in the dust, as the column marched past. The baggage animals, the lifeline of the army, began to die in droves. Without water, the horses and mules collapsed under their loads. The soldiers were forced to abandon their own equipment, and soon the treasure they had carried from India, the gold, the silver, the precious stones, lay scattered in the sand, worthless. The army survived by eating anything they could find, the dates from the few stunted palms, and the marrow from the palm trees themselves, which they pounded into a paste. It was during this hellish march that they encountered the ichthyophagy. To the starving Greeks, these people must have seemed like creatures from another world. They lived in huts built of whale bones and shells. They had no grain, no herds, no vineyards. Their entire existence revolved around the sea. They caught fish in nets made of palm bark, dried them in the sun, and pounded them into a coarse flour. This was their bread. They even fed the fish to their cattle, whose flesh, as a result, reeked of fish. The encounter was a clash of two worlds. The world conquerors, masters of Asia, were reduced to begging for scraps from a people they considered subhuman. In this land of bone huts and fish-eaters, that one of the most famous stories of the march occurred. A group of soldiers, searching desperately for water, found a small, miserable trickle seeping from a rock. They collected what they could in a helmet and brought it to Alexander. It was a gesture of ultimate loyalty, offering their king the one thing that could save them. But Alexander, in full view of the army, took the helmet and slowly poured the water out onto the sand. He would not drink what his men could not share. It was a moment of profound leadership, a refusal to be separated from his soldiers even by a sip of water. But it was also a stark admission of how desperate their situation had become. As the army staggered through the wasteland, the question echoes louder with each step. Why? Why did the greatest military mind of the age lead his men into this deliberate destruction? The decision to cross the Gedrosian Desert has been analyzed for over 2,000 years, and it remains the most controversial act of Alexander's career. The first explanation is the strategic one, and it has its merits. Alexander needed to support his fleet. Admiral Nearchus had been tasked with exploring the sea route from the Indus to the Persian Gulf, a voyage of immense geographical importance. He needed watering stations and safe harbors along the way. If Alexander's army could march parallel to the coast, they could dig wells and establish depots, ensuring the fleet's survival. From this perspective, the march was not madness, but a necessary part of a grand, coordinated plan to open a sea route between India and Mesopotamia. But this explanation on its own feels incomplete. Alexander could have supported the fleet by marching a smaller, more mobile force along the coast. He did not need to drag the bulk of his army, with its thousands of camp followers and baggage animals, through the most dangerous part of the desert. He could have sent Craterus's entire force through the safe northern route and taken only a small contingent south. He chose instead to take a massive force, including the non-combatants, into the furnace. This leads to the second, more compelling explanation: hubris. The ancient sources are clear. Nearchus himself, who was with Alexander, recorded that the king was aware of the hardships. He knew the stories of Semiramis and Cyrus, but he was consumed by the ambition to lead his army through in safety as a conqueror, to succeed where the legendary Persian kings had failed so spectacularly. This was not just about supply lines, it was about legacy. Alexander was no longer competing with Darius or Porus, he was competing with the mythical heroes and god-kings of the past. Recent scholarship has deepened this view, placing Alexander's decision within the context of Achaemenid imperial ideology. For centuries, Persian kings had used the claim of controlling the deserts, of taming the untamable, as a tool to assert their royal authority. By marching through Gedrosia, Alexander was not just trying to outdo Cyrus, he was trying to appropriate that very ideology. He was making a statement to the Persian nobles and satraps who now served him. The new king of Asia could do what even the greatest of their own kings could not. He was proving his legitimacy through an act of supreme endurance. If this was his goal, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The desert cared nothing for royal ideology. The result was not a glorious triumph, but a slow-motion disaster that consumed thousands of lives and shattered the morale of his army. In trying to prove he was greater than the gods of Persia, Alexander committed the greatest blunder of his career. The cost of his ambition was about to be counted. After 60 days of marching through what can only be described as hell, the remnants of Alexander's army finally stumbled out of the Gedrosian Desert and into the fertile land of Carmania. They emerged not as a conquering army, but as ghosts. They were sun-blackened, skeletal, and half-mad with thirst. Their clothes hung in rags, their weapons were gone, and their eyes held the hollow look of men who had seen the dead rise and fall with every step. The contrast was jarring. In Carmania, there was water, there was shade, there was food. The army that entered this paradise was a shadow of the force that had left Patala months earlier. The exact numbers are debated by historians, but the scale of the loss is undeniable. While ancient sources often exaggerate, modern estimates suggest that Alexander lost at least 12,000 soldiers. Some historians believe he lost 3/4 of the force that entered the desert. The camp followers, the women and children who had accompanied the army, were almost entirely gone. The baggage train, with its treasures and records, had been abandoned in the sand. The army's animals, the horses and mules essential for any future campaign, had perished by the thousands. It was here, in Carmania, that the pieces of Alexander's scattered forces began to reunite. First came Nearchus, sailing into a harbor with his fleet. He had survived his own ordeal, but his ships were battered and his men were weary. He found Alexander, and the king, upon hearing that the fleet was safe, reportedly wept with joy. Soon after, Craterus arrived with the main army from the north. They were healthy, well supplied, and fully equipped. They looked upon their king and his ragged survivors with a mixture of pity and shock. The reunion was bittersweet. The army that had been divided was whole again, but at a terrible cost. The precise number of dead will never be known, but the best estimates point to a staggering loss. Of the roughly 30,000 soldiers who entered the desert, perhaps only 10,000 to 12,000 marched out. The non-combatants, the thousands of women, children, and camp followers who had no place in the official casualty lists, simply vanished into the sand. The army had not been defeated in battle, it had been erased by geography. To lift the spirits of his surviving men, Alexander ordered a week of celebration. For 7 days the army marched through Carmania in a drunken, bacchanalian procession. Alexander himself led the revelry, imitating the god Dionysus, who was said to have marched back from India in just such a triumphant, wine-soaked parade. It was a deliberate piece of theater, an attempt to mask disaster with the trappings of divine triumph. But no amount of wine could wash away the memory of the desert. The men had seen their king lead them to the brink of annihilation. The myth of Alexander's invincibility, the belief that he could conquer any obstacle, had died in the sands of Gedrosia. The price of glory had been paid, and the cost was almost too high to bear. The Gedrosian Desert did not kill Alexander the Great, but it broke something essential in him and in his empire. The march stands as a turning point, a hinge upon which the fate of his conquests swung. Before the desert, Alexander was an unstoppable force, a leader whose men would follow him to the ends of the earth. After the desert, that unquestioning loyalty was replaced by a simmering resentment, and his vision of a unified empire began to fray. The immediate aftermath was marked by paranoia and purge. At the Carmanian celebrations, Alexander ordered the execution of several satraps and generals accused of corruption and abuse of power during his long absence in India. Cleander, who had been left in Media, was put to death, along with 600 of his soldiers. Whether these men were truly guilty or simply scapegoats for the empire's growing instability is impossible to say. But the message was clear. The king's patience was gone, and his trust in his own men was shaken. The desert march had also decimated the Macedonian core of his army. The veterans who had marched with him from Greece, the men who had won every battle from Granicus to Hydaspes, were the ones who had suffered most in Gedrosia. They were the ones who had died by the thousands. Their loss weakened the essential bond between the king and his countrymen. In their place, Alexander was forced to rely more heavily on Persian soldiers and nobles, a policy that further alienated his Macedonian troops. The unity of his army, always a fragile alliance of different peoples, was shattered. The psychological toll on Alexander himself may have been the most significant. The historian Arrian, drawing on earlier sources, notes that the king became increasingly suspicious and prone to fits of rage in the year following the march. He drank more heavily, he listened more readily to flatterers and informers. The grand, unifying vision of a Greco-Persian empire seemed to give way to a more autocratic and paranoid rule. The man who had poured out the water for his men in the desert was becoming a different kind of king. Less than a year after emerging from Gedrosia, Alexander was back in Babylon, planning new campaigns, an expedition into Arabia, and perhaps even a push west towards Carthage. But the army that surrounded him was not the army that had conquered the world. It was a force still recovering from its wounds, its ranks filled with new recruits who had never known victory under his banner. On the eve of his Arabian expedition, In June of 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill after a night of heavy drinking. 10 days later, he was dead. He was 32 years old. The empire he had built did not survive him. Without his singular will to hold it together, it fractured almost immediately, torn apart by his generals in a generation of brutal civil war. And while no single event caused the collapse, the seeds of that destruction were sown in the sands of Gedrosia. The desert did not break Alexander's body, but it broke the spirit of his army, tarnished his legend, and weakened the foundations of his empire. In the end, the desert had the last word. It remains there today, vast and silent, the bones of Alexander's army still buried beneath its shifting dunes. It is a reminder that even for the greatest of conquerors, there are some lands that cannot be conquered, some forces that cannot be tamed. Alexander the Great met his match not in an army or a king, but in a desert that cared nothing for glory. Alexander the Great died 1 year after emerging from the Gedrosian Desert. He was 32 years old. His empire, the largest the world had ever seen, crumbled within a generation. Historians have debated for centuries what killed him: poison, disease, or simply too much wine. But those who marched with him knew the truth. The desert had already done its work. It had broken something in their king that could never be repaired. Today, the Makran coast remains one of the most desolate places on earth. The sands have long since swallowed the bones of Alexander's army. But if you listen closely, on a hot summer night when the wind blows from the east, you can still hear it. The ghost of an army, marching toward a horizon they would never reach. If you enjoy unraveling war mysteries with us, hit that like button and subscribe to Chronicles of Command for more untold stories from the front lines.